Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Remedies. I'm a senior principal at Geotech Consultants in Oakland and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. I have the pleasure of facilitating today's event. This webinar focuses on DoD-funded research efforts on transitioning from active to passive remedies at DoD sites. First, Dr. Dave Adamson from GSI Environmental will discuss the development of a web-based application to assist site managers in assessing transition from active remedies to natural attenuation. Second, Dr. Paul Tretniak from Oregon Health and Science University will talk about the development of a quantitative framework for predicting abiotic attenuation under natural and transitional site management scenarios. Each of the two presentations will be followed by a brief Q&A session, and depending on time, we will conclude the webinar with a longer Q&A session. The next several slides provide instructions on optimizing your webinar experience. If you have not done so already, please download Zoom at the link shown here and provided to you in your registration confirmation email. If you cannot download Zoom, you can view the slides using a compatible internet browser such as Firefox, IE, or Edge, and by creating a free Zoom account. If you are unable to view the slides or if your screen freezes, try keying in Control and F5 to perform a hard refresh of your screen. If you're accessing the audio through your computer, click the arrow next to the Join Audio button, select Test Speaker and Microphone, and follow the prompts as they appear on your screen. If you continue to experience difficulties, just call into the conference line shown here. You may also submit a comment using the chat box. Please use the chat box only for comments related to technical difficulties because the Q&A option should be reserved for questions for our speakers. And in case of continued technical difficulties, just download a PDF of the slides from the webinar webpage and call into the conference line. Note that another viewing option is the live stream on the SERDP and ESTCP YouTube channel at the link shown here. Today's broadcast will be listen only. Please submit questions using the Q&A box on the screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A periods to submit your questions. We do encourage you to get them in as you think of them. And when you submit your questions, we would appreciate it if you can please add your organization name at the end of your question so that we can identify it during the Q&A sessions. With that, I would like to introduce Cara Patton, who is an environmental project manager at Nobles and the technical assistant for SERDP and ESTCP's environmental restoration program area. Cara has worked with SERDP and ESTCP since 2008, and prior to that, she worked at the Drug Enforcement Administration as a forensic chemist. Cara received her master's degree in chemistry from George Mason University. Cara, please proceed.
Thank you, Rula. I'm happy to welcome everyone to today's SERDP ESTCP webinar. The next few slides will provide a quick overview of SERDP and ESTCP. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the DoD, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. SERDP's mission is to identify and address high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on DoD requirements. SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impact real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP or other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. SERDP and ESTCP are complementary programs, with much of SERDP research occurring at the lab and pilot scale, with occasional field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, although occasionally supporting lab efforts are conducted. There are several environmental drivers for the type of work funded by SERDP and ESTCP, with underlying objective of sustaining DoD ranges, facilities, and operations. This, as you can imagine, is a broad undertaking. It takes the form of looking at maritime sustainability, threatened and endangered species, climate impacts, unexploded ordnance and munitions constituents, as well as other environmental drivers. One key environmental driver is the reduction of current and future environmental liabilities. This involves addressing contamination from past practices, including impacts to groundwater, soils and sediments, UXO contamination, and developing management approaches for contaminants of emerging concern. The second part of this is pollution prevention, with a focus on eliminating chemicals of concern or hazardous materials in manufacturing, maintenance, and operations on our installations. We have several main focus areas for research and demonstration at SERDP and ESTCP, as are shown here on this slide. As mentioned earlier, technology transfer is very important within the SERDP and ESTCP programs. Technology transfer efforts include the development of videos, training workshops, and guidance documents. The webinar series is a substantial component of our technology transfer efforts. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts from all of our program areas. The next ER webinar is on December 7th on forensic methods for PFAS source tracking and allocation. Registration is open for webinars through the end of this year. You can find additional information about upcoming webinars at this link. All past webinars are archived and can be accessed using this link here. I would like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar webpage. We would appreciate it if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of this webcast. Finally, please save the date for the 2023 symposium, which will be held between Tuesday, November 28th and Friday, December 1st in Arlington, Virginia. I hope you enjoy the webinar today.
Thank you so much, Cara. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Dave Adamson, who is a Vice President and Principal Engineer at GSI Environmental. Dave has more than 22 years of experience with a focus on chemical fate and transport, emerging contaminants, and remediation. His professional experience includes site investigation, characterization, and remediation with projects in the US and internationally. Dave has co-authored over 60 published technical articles and has served as a PI or co-PI on over 20 DoD-sponsored research projects. He received a doctoral degree in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Iowa. Dave, we're happy to have you. Please get us started.
All right, well, thanks, Rula. Our project team, we have a SERDP project that I'll be discussing today. It's got a wide range of sort of elements to it, a lot of which deal with the different things that they're involved with long-term site management, and particularly those where some type of active treatment is being done and where there's a consideration to transition to monitor natural attenuation. So these are sites that have a lot of monitoring data. We've done a lot of work on past projects as well as this project in analyzing those type of data. And these help establish some of the challenges that we're dealing with when we're managing these types of sites. What I'm going to discuss today is a decision tool that we're in the process of finalizing, and it's designed to help site managers through this whole process. And again, particularly in those cases where they want to transition to something like M&A. So what I'm going to do today is give a sneak preview of this tool. It's a web-based free tool to help give everybody an idea of what it's all about. All right, the outline for today's talk, just a little bit about what problem we're trying to address, I'm going to define this transition assessment term, which is something that a lot of people talk about, but maybe really haven't understood exactly what it is. Our objective then is to talk really about this decision support tool. And so I'll spend most of the time during this presentation describing some of the key tool modules. We'll then end with some conclusions as well as highlighting the benefits to DoD. All right, well, our problem statement, it's actually, really fundamental, and it's summarized by these 3 points. First off is that we've got a whole suite of different remediation technologies that we've been relying on for the past several decades. They're not exactly cheap to implement, especially at larger sites. And as we all know, they're not necessarily perfect. There's little expectation that you're going to get rid of all of the mass just by implementing any of these one particular technologies. And the reason behind that is increased understanding of the complexity of these sites and how that influences the amount of mass that's really available to treat. So matrix diffusion is one of those processes, particularly at these heterogeneous sites, where that mass gets into these lower permeability zones, and it's just really difficult to target and can increase the amount of time in which that contaminant can stick around at a particular site. So what we're sort of left with then is these sites where we've sort of hit a wall. Everything that we're doing is sort of not necessarily leading to vast improvements. And it's because of the fact that that mass that's remaining is hard to treat in an efficient way. So this leads us to sort of thinking about what to do next at a lot of these sites. I've got one site I think that I've dealt with for 18 years since the first treatment, and we're sort of in this process now of deciding what to do next, what to transition to. And so in 2013, the NRC came out with this great sort of document where they discussed this in context of these complex contaminated groundwater sites. And what they said was that at these sites, contaminant concentrations in the plume remain stalled at levels above cleanup goals despite continued operation of remedial systems. They said there's no clear path forward. And then they also point out that the effectiveness of site remediation, when you've got this point of diminishing returns, that's the perfect opportunity to transition to these other active or passive management approaches, things like monitored natural attenuation, and to do that in sort of a more formal way. So they proposed in this document, these sort of 3 key elements. Those are listed here. First is going through the conceptual site model and understanding the complexities at that site and what the implication of those complexities are for achieving cleanup goals. Secondly, is do a very quantitative assessment of your concentration trends, be it at an extraction well or various monitoring wells across the site, to understand what's really going on in terms of the performance of what existing remediation systems might be doing, and then identify, if you want to transition, what appropriate approaches might be available for you, things like monitored natural attenuation. So these are what they outlined, but they didn't put a prescriptive sort of way to do this. They're just trying to say that these are the things that you need to do. It's sort of up to you to evaluate these on a site-specific basis on how they might lead you to transition to a different approach. So our project simply was trying to take that a little bit of a step further. We're trying to develop a quantitative approach. We're doing it through this web-based tool, a decision tool that's providing stakeholders with a way to do this, a way to really technically document how they're going to transition from any active treatment to something like M&A. So, this is an example of a concentration versus time chart where you've got things going down over time, but maybe then plateauing over the near-term data over several years, such that you need to determine when you can transition to something else. So again, the sort of key element of our project is to develop this web-based tool. The screenshot of the homepage is right here. I will say, this webinar doesn't lend itself to doing a live demo. I'm not sure I would have the ability to do that anyway. a little bit risky to do that, but so I'll be showing some screenshots from this tool through the course of this presentation. But we're calling this TA squared, Teaching Assistant for Transition Assessments. Again, it's relatively simple. This is a web-based app, so it's going to run in anybody's web browser. You don't have to download this onto your machine or anything like that. So that helps in terms of sort of these compatibility issues that some people have with different types of software platforms that might have been used in the past. The platform that we're using for this is called R-Shiny. So it's something that we've used before, and a lot of folks have used to sort of support these sort of decision tools. So it's good for data visualization, data analysis. And what we have in here, you can see, are these different buttons. These represent different modules within the tool that people can navigate through. So we'll show some of these here in a second. What I really want to point out with this tool is that, you know, it's something it's got these different modules. So some people can go through it and they can essentially say, hey, I want to answer a specific question. And so they can just find sort of the answer to that question within this by going through that particular module. If there's a case where they want to sort of do a comprehensive transition assessment, they can go sort of stepwise through the entire process. So we're trying to make sure that there's different ways of using this type of information that might be appropriate for different users. But we've got 10 different modules. I'll show those here in a second. They're sort of divvied up into sort of quantitative analysis tools as well as qualitative learning tools. So that's shown in this slide right here. We've sort of got these blue boxes on the left. These are the quantitative analysis tools. So those are designed to answer really specific questions. So I'll spend the rest of this presentation sort of looking at those. On the right are the more qualitative tools. And so these are, again, just sort of these learning modules. So a person can go through, get a quick summary of these different topics that are on here, and then also get an idea of where to go for more information. So those are things like, you know, how to model a groundwater plume for the purposes of a transition assessment. How to know more about enhanced attenuation processes, understanding how much heterogeneity might be present at a particular site. And then we've also got this module where we've got links to these other transition assessment projects that SERDP is sponsoring. And then in the middle there is this sort of summary module. So that's designed to sort of capture information from the different other tools. It's also got this metric within here that we call the Remediation Transition Assessment Index, the RTAI. So we've designed that as sort of a simple metric, a 1 to 5 metric. It takes information from the other tools, sort of combines it into that specific number to give somebody an idea, is my site a good candidate for transition or not? And so that's what's in module 10, and we'll show that here in a second. All right, so to start off, when somebody's interacting with this, they do need to get their data into this tool. And so essentially this tool is taking monitoring data, long-term monitoring data, concentration versus time data for any particular locations, and then just cataloging that. There's guidance for how that can be entered into there. It's not really that difficult of a process. There's not necessarily all that many fields, but it does have to be sort of cataloged in this way. It includes, you know, concentrations as well as coordinates for the monitoring locations. Once that's done a single time, you don't have to do it again. You don't necessarily have to also store any of this information in the cloud. It's stored locally on your machine. So the data input and customization of that data into a format that this tool can use is a key first initial step. All right, well then tool one, the sort of first thing that a person encounters in here is this idea of the asymptotes. And this is really a key element of the transition assessments, particularly at those sites where maybe a pump and treat system is in place. And that's establishing whether the data that you have, the concentration versus time, and that's what's shown here in this figure, whether there's a plateau in the recent years that can support the fact or serve as a line of evidence that performance is sort of declining over time. So in this particular tool, it's displaying the concentration for a particular location. It can also do, you know, average concentrations over multiple locations, but it's allowing a user to then select a breakpoint. So that's what this dotted vertical line is here. A breakpoint at which you want to calculate a rate coefficient associated with an early period versus a late period. So it's really that late period data and how it's different from the earlier period that can show that you've got a different a slowdown in those rates. And so it will display those rates for the different period. It'll put some bounding on this in terms of sort of confidence intervals. And then it'll also project the time at which, if you've got a specified cleanup level in here, at which you'd anticipate that goal to be met based on these current trends. So that's one of the ways that it does that. And then it goes through those data and then sort of does this checklist in terms of, does it meet these asymptotic conditions? So it's saying, are the two slopes different, meaning that you've got this difference in sort of the rates over time? Are things different than zero? Do you have a difference of more than two times in the first period versus the second period, and so on and so forth? And you're sort of lining up these conditions to whether things sort of satisfy different measures of an asymptote over time. So it's developing a line of evidence, and in this particular case, for this example, all 5 of those are met, and so it's a good indication that yes, the performance at this particular set of wells has plateaued. Another key element of a transition assessment then is to assess plume stability. So a stable plume is something that is obviously more conducive to then transition to M&A. So within Tool 2, it's going to do a spatial as well as a temporal analysis. And so this is showing a plot of data from monitoring wells, various monitoring wells that might be present in your plume. And then it's doing a Mann-Kendall, a non-parametric statistical trend analysis to show you what the trend is in a set of wells, as well as individual wells, to get an understanding of the stability characteristics within that particular plume. This happens to be points that are overlaid essentially on where our office is located in Houston. So this is very much a hypothetical plume, although I will say that the data right underneath our building shows a decreasing trend. So this is information, that you're going to want to be able to collect. You're going to want to be able to establish, particularly at the leading edge of a plume, demonstrate that your plume is not expanding and may be ready to transition to monitored natural attenuation. Next up is another critical element, and then that's the remediation timeframe estimates. So Tool 1 can give you an estimate of the remediation timeframe at a particular well. But what this tool is really designed to do is then to say, if I was to go in and remove the mass at the source, what would my expected remediation timeframe be after that action? So a good way to do this is through setting up a model, and in particular the RemChlor MD model, which is a nice model that was developed as part of an earlier ESTCP project by Dr. Ron Falta at Clemson University with help from GSI. And it incorporates the matrix diffusion processes into that, which can slow down or essentially lengthen the amount of time to get to a particular cleanup goal. When we originally started this project, we thought, okay, we'll run these lots and lots of simulations with this model, sort of develop these different type sites and understand what the impact for various hydrogeologic characteristics, site-specific characteristics might be on that remediation timeframe. But it turns out that right before that, Dr. Bob Borden had this project where he essentially did pretty much that exact same thing. They went through and did 28,000 RemChlor MD simulations, a whole lot of simulations, and generated these remediation timeframes for a whole bunch of different initial conditions. So our job became a little bit easier, and Bob and his group published this paper in Science of the Total Environment that lays this out. Our job was easier to essentially then take that information, sort of distill it down into an easy interface so that a user can enter their site-specific information and get these estimates along with some uncertainty analysis associated with those estimates. So a user goes in, they input their data, it's things like where their source location is, where monitoring well locations are, the year that the source started, a year that the source was removed, because again, that's what you're trying to do here is determine what happens after you remove that source, as well as concentration profiles. Then they're entering their hydrogeologic data. So this is a setting where you can choose between sort of where you're placing relevant low K zones that might be adjacent or within the transmissive zones that you're trying to clean up. And so you're putting information related to what site characteristics might be closest to your particular site, so that information can get used to pull those model simulations that are most closely aligned with your particular site. And then what the tool will do is then essentially plot that information over time. So this is a case where it's showing the concentration in a particular well that you're trying to monitor over time, and it's saying how long it's going to take after you remove that source to get to those particular cleanup levels. And so in this case, it's one where matrix diffusion is very active. So the time it's going to take if you're removing that source in 2020, which is here on the far left side, it's going to be a long time. And so this is evidence, again, if you're using this as part of a transition assessment, you're saying, well, I'd like to transition to something more passive, because even if I try to remove all of that mass through one of these active remediation technologies, it's still going to take me a really, really long time to get there. All right, tool 4 is another that focuses on sort of remediation performance. And this is trying to answer the question is, what level of performance can I expect from an in situ remediation technology? So not necessarily long-term, but right away, what concentration reductions might I actually expect? So this is taking data that we had compiled as part of an earlier ESTCP project, where we're looking at hundreds of different sites where these in situ treatment technologies have been implemented, and then tracking what actual performance they achieved. So this chart on the left-hand side is this triangle chart, and what it's plotting, each of those individual points is an individual site. And so the x-axis is the maximum concentration before treatment, and then the y-axis is the minimum concentration after treatment. So that any single point is showing what that paired of concentrations represent. So if something didn't change, it's going to fall sort of on this 1-to-1 line where the remediation didn't make any difference. But the farther down and to the right means that the performance of that technology achieved a greater reduction in the concentration after it was implemented. So something like this point right here, they achieved a 1 order of magnitude reduction in that concentration after implementing that treatment. And so this tool will go in and sort of plot all of the data. It'll allow you to sort of select based on specific technologies. Maybe you were only interested in something like bioremediation, what the performances are with that particular technology. But it's giving you essentially a benchmarking opportunity to say, what would I expect my concentrations, reasonable performance for this remediation technology to achieve for concentrations after it's implemented. Okay, we come to tool 5 then. This is sort of the last of the really quantitative ones, but it's an important one. And it's saying not necessarily what's going on in the source, but what's happening in the plume. And one of the key elements from monitored natural attenuation is to say, would attenuation in the plume be able to ensure me that I'm going to be able to get to a goal concentration at a down gradient point of compliance? So this is really looking more at concentration versus distance. And in this case, you need to know what that rate is. You need to have some confidence that you can estimate that concentration change with those distances. And that can be done either getting a rate with field data, or it can get get a rate constant from some sort of a lab-based assay. So this tool allows one or different options to be used. And again, all it's trying to do is forecast what the plume extent is going to be down gradient of a particular source as you work towards that point of compliance over time, either naturally or after shutting off a pump and treat well, for example. And again, if that forecasted concentration, that point of compliance is below the goal, then this supports transitioning to something like M&A. So this tool has a whole series of screens. The screenshot right here is essentially showing the first of those where the user is allowed to sort of estimate what a rate coefficient would be, a reasonable rate coefficient would be for this particular site. And this is showing concentration versus distance using data that were collected prior to the implementation of an active remedy. So maybe before a pumping well was installed. And so these data are important because this shows what that natural assimilative capacity of the aquifer is. So these particular data, you sort of see a general downward trend, and the regression plots this sort of the line, the best fit line through there, the slope of which can then be translated into a rate coefficient. So that's what this tool is doing. It's giving you this sort of a rate coefficient, a natural attenuation rate that you can use for future plume projections. So that's the next step in the tool, is that I've selected a rate coefficient. In this case, I use that sort of pre-remediation data. Now I'm going to move into my post-remediation period. I'm going to say, can I reach that concentration goal? That concentration goal is represented by this horizontal dotted line by the time I reach my point of compliance. So that's this vertical purple line. In this particular case, in this post-remediation period, maybe this is the concentration at a particular well, might be the concentration at a pumping well, maybe after a rebound test. And you're saying that rate, is it enough to get me down by the time I get to that point of compliance? In this case, it is. It's giving you a concentration that's there. It's giving you with some degree of confidence based on this sort of 90-degree confidence level. So it gives you some assurance that natural attenuation would be enough at this particular site. Okay, so that's a flavor of some of the tools. Those information from those various quantitative tools, we're trying to pull in then to sort of this summary tool. And so what we're outlining here on this particular slide is sort of the decision process that one might go through specific to transitioning to something like M&A. So up top under that number 1 is sort of these bright line criteria for M&A. So that's going through what I just showed, which is tool 5, essentially this idea that can I reach my concentration goal at a point of compliance with M&A? And then secondly, do I have information on the remediation time frame that says that M&A is essentially going to be comparable to any other alternatives that might be available to me? So if something like tool 3, you go through and you say implementing that active technology isn't going to get me all that much of a shorter remediation time frame, then that's evidence that M&A might be a more efficient long-term management strategy at that particular site. After that, we have this second step in there, and that's the Remediation Transition Assessment Index. And so this is something that we sort of developed. It's a simple metric, as I said before. It's sort of this 1 to 5 metric. If you take your information from your previous tools, it'll assign a number to each one of those. It'll then use that to sort of calculate this metric for your site. Something like a 1 is going to be a candidate where your site is not a good candidate for transitioning, and a 5 is a number that's associated with a good candidate. So it's attempting to just sort of distill all this individual information into one sort of simple metric. And so that's what that's designed to do. And then finally, for somebody who's doing sort of this comprehensive step-by-step transition assessment, we've got this sort of checklist within tool 10. So this is walking somebody through the entire process, and it starts with these things that are, what the NRC laid out, going through your site complexities, then going through the quantitative assessment, looking at asymptote stability, those sorts of things. And then walking a person through the alternative approaches, including the lines of evidence for things like M&A, as well as the need to go to enhanced attenuation type processes. So this is not something that necessarily everybody would need to do, particularly if they're only interested in 1 or 2 portions of a transition assessment. But it's there in case somebody wants to document this in a transparent manner and make sure that they've sort of checked all of those boxes. Okay, so again, we're trying to work on this idea that people need a technical basis for doing these transition assessments. It's very important to sort of document these lines of evidence that M&A might be an appropriate long-term management strategy for a lot of these sites. So that's what this tool is designed to do. And the platform that this tool is also intended to be useful for a lot of different types of users. Those people who want to go through individual modules, do something relatively quick, they can access those. People that want to get more of a comprehensive approach to transition assessment, it's built for those people as well. And the benefits to DoD are pretty simple, but we've got this tool. It's available for site managers, site contractors, those sorts of things as well. But again, it's designed to be free. It should be compatible with most people's devices, and it'll be supported through a lot of sort of guidance and help information that's integrated into the tool itself. We will be doing a series of case studies. Those are sort of ongoing right now. So there are 4 or 5 different sites where we're sort of applying the elements of this tool to real sites, and we'll report on those within the report for this project. We also have a training webinar where we'll actually do sort of live demos of this particular tool, go through some of those case studies as well as part of further tech transfer for this particular project. I would like to acknowledge the rest of our project team. Dr. Chuck Newell, Dr. Hiroko Hort in our office have been really instrumental in terms of making this a reality. And then John Wilson, who has a lot of the vision behind this. He has some really, really, great fundamental knowledge about a lot of these things, and as well as, how users, how people should use this information. And so he's been extremely helpful in doing a lot of this work and being, again, the real vision behind this project at the outset. So I think that's all I have. Rula, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. And just as a reminder for our audience, please submit questions using the Q&A box on the screen. We have received several questions that Dave will answer now. I'm going to start off, Dave, with a question from the Delaware Natural Resources and Environmental Control, the remediation section. In Tool 1, is there guidance on how to select a breakpoint?
That's a really good question. If you go into the literature, there is, statistical methods for essentially that will give you an answer on what they think the appropriate breakpoint is. And we did toy with including that within this tool, and we may still. I think that in some ways we wanted to err on the side of giving the user the ability to pick that themselves. And so we do have guidance essentially in the help button for that on where a person should place that. We also, in this case, have the ability, a person can place that breakpoint anywhere. There is some subjectivity to it, obviously, but it allows a user to go in and very quickly say, well, I'm going to put the breakpoint here. What is the confidence interval on that rate coefficient for the first period versus the second period as well? They can then move that breakpoint, slightly, and if that improves the confidence intervals on the various rate coefficients, it's an indication that the second point that they picked is probably a better point. So it's sort of it allows for an iterative approach, and then it allows for somebody to see how that selection impacts the rate coefficients it's generating. So that's sort of the guidance that's built into there, but it allows the user to play with that breakpoint and do it relatively quickly.
Great, thank you so much. This next question is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Is there a user's manual yet for this tool that is downloadable? And I just checked your webpage that we show on this slide. It doesn't have a link to where the tool can be downloaded. Can you give us some direction on how people can download the tool and whether a user's manual is available that can also be downloaded, Dave?
Another good question. I should have emphasized that this tool is still being finalized, so the link to downloading it is yet to be posted. That's sort of why this is a sneak preview, coming attractions, but it will be hopefully available by the end of the year. To answer the question about a user's guide, we will have a user's guide associated with this. It also embedded within basically any time that a user is asked to enter any specific piece of information, adjacent to that question is going to be a little question mark, which is a help button. What happens then is essentially, a pop-up will then give the user information about maybe how to answer that particular question. if it asks for a parameter value, it might give suggestions on a default value to enter for that. So there's help within the tool itself, as well as an accompanying user manual that will be there too.
Great, thank you. This next question is from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Can you discuss some of the limitations or uncertainties associated with this tool?
Yeah, that is one of those things that we try to incorporate to the extent possible. And so a lot of the things that are quantitative within here, so anytime that we've got a rate coefficient that's generated out of this, or anytime that we have a remediation timeframe that's generated out of this, we're trying to put confidence intervals on those. And so some of that becomes naturally because, the rate coefficient is a statistical, representation of the data. So it lends itself well to that. The remediation timeframe, we've got all of these simulations that are sort of built into the matrix diffusion aspect of that, the REMCLOR MD way that those were generated. And so what's shown there is really a Monte Carlo analysis of all these sort of simulations. So there's a band of certainty that's presented when we put those information, and that's in tool 3. So to the extent practical, we've tried to incorporate or show or be transparent about the amount of uncertainty that's associated with any particular estimate.
Great, thank you. This next question is from US EPA. Is climate change being addressed by this tool, especially inland and with respect to coastal flooding and extreme precipitation? And will decisions be made in context of future groundwater demand and needed quality?
Not explicitly, a little bit outside of the scope of what this project was designed to do. I can imagine elements of that could be incorporated into this, maybe not necessarily in a quantitative manner. It is an interesting question. It's something that we can definitely ponder among our project team if there's ways to sort of think about this. I mean, if it's to the point, where you've got climate change and you're causing, a lot of this is groundwater based, and if you're causing changes in groundwater elevations or changes in groundwater flow, that necessarily needs to be incorporated into, plume stability analysis or things like that. So it is an interesting question and something that we'll think a little bit more about.
Thank you, Dave. This next question is from Chevron Technical Center. Can you provide your rationale for using a 10-year half-life as a reference for slow attenuation rates?
It's a really good question. We have thought a little bit about that. In some ways, 10 years is a little bit arbitrary in that case, but it's sort of thinking about things. If a 30-year time frame is sort of what some guidance talks about as sort of a reasonable remediation time frame, and then so a 10-year half-life will get you, it's essentially three increments within a 30-year interval. And so if you need to get to a 90% concentration reduction, for example, you wouldn't get there within 30 years if you had a 10-year half-life. So that's some of the considerations that went into that. But I do understand that in some ways that could be a little bit subjective, depending on the site-specific consideration and what might be considered a reasonable remediation timeframe for that particular site.
Thank you, Dave. We have time for one quick question, and then we're going to transition to Paul, and we'll get back to you towards the end of the webinar. But really quickly, this question is from Project Navigator. Assuming that all the appropriate data is readily available, how many hours are required to go through all 10 tools, roughly speaking?
Well, it's going to depend a little bit on the data input screen. And so let's separate that out. I think people have been familiar with, if you have a lot of data, it could take a while to get through that. But if you have all your data ready to analyze, it's going to be probably a couple hours to go through the rest of the tools.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, we'll get back to Dave towards the end, but it is time to move on to our second presentation for today, which will be presented by Dr. Paul Tretniak. Paul is a professor in the School of Public Health at the Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. He joined the faculty in the Department of Environmental Science and Engineering in '91. There, he became involved in OGI's Center for Groundwater Research and the University of Waterloo's Solvents in Groundwater Research Consortium. The latter allowed Paul to become one of the first researchers to focus on zero-valent iron for the remediation of contaminated groundwater. In the 30 years since, Paul has published a large body of high-impact research on zero-valent iron, as well as other aspects of in situ chemical reduction and oxidation. This includes some of the earliest work on the abiotic reduction of contaminants, which foreshadowed many of the fundamental aspects of what is known as abiotic natural attenuation. Paul received a bachelor's degree from Williams College and a doctoral degree in applied chemistry from the Colorado School of Mines. Paul, we're delighted to have you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Rula, and SERDP for inviting me to present on the results of this Project ER 201357. It's a collaboration between myself and investigators at the University of Iowa and Newcastle University. The project is mainly about the role of reactive mineral phases in abiotic natural attenuation, and I'll be elaborating on what all that means in just a second. This version of the presentation is as much as possible trying to highlight the implications that might have for how one might manage active to passive transitions in the management of a field site. So the project was originally conceived to be part of a sort of a bigger wrapper conceptual context that we gave it, and for the proposal that we wrote, we used this figure that's shown here on the right, where we gave this sort of the largest, broadest context we called adaptive site management, and that's in the green box on the outside. And then within that, we designated that you need to be working from a conceptual site model, which is the inner box there. And then in order to have a conceptual site model, it would have elements like site characterization, process characterization, and remedy evaluation. This is the kind of stuff that Dave just talked about. It's really not my expertise or sphere, but we wanted to put our project in that broader context. We're going to focus pretty specifically on a subset of that, which is highlighted in the red text under process characterization. Our focus is really on this question of, is there a significant role for abiotic degradation in natural attenuation? And then a corollary to that would be how might that be influenced by active to passive transitions in the management of a site. So the backstory behind this is illustrated in this next couple of slides. Around the time that we were writing the proposal, there was two papers that were in press. One from Michelle Scherer's group, and that paper had this graphical abstract, which illustrates the main point of that, which was that when they tried to measure degradation of TCE in batch bottle experiments in the lab under highly controlled conditions using magnetite as the reductant, they were not able to get any measurable reactivity. When they added iron 2 to that system to stimulate the reducing capacity perhaps of the magnetite, they still didn't get any significant TCE reduction until they exceeded the solubility product for ferrous iron hydroxide. And so at that point, you start to precipitate FeOH2, which is in this system is a white flock. And then you can see that visually in the experiment, and then you start to see evidence for reduction. And so this led to the conclusion that there was a phase that was forming in the system that was necessary and primarily responsible for the dechlorination that they observed. And then right around the same time, slightly thereafter, there was another paper also involving Michelle Shearer, but led by Anka Newman, that did something similar except with clay minerals. So they start with iron 2 bearing clays, and that's the bottle on the left, and they add PCE and TCE, and they don't see any evidence for dechlorination. This would be the hypothetical purely abiotic transformation process. But when they add enough iron 2 to generate secondary mineral phases, which cause the color change in the bottle on the right, then they start to see degradation. And they have some additional supporting data in the paper. For example, the figure on the upper right shows the total C2 products formed from dechlorination versus time. And you see that in the blue one, you see accumulation of products for the clay with iron 2 added under conditions where the secondary precipitates form. And in the red symbols, they don't see any evidence for degradation and under conditions where this secondary phase doesn't form. And they have things like Mossbauer spectroscopy to try to begin to characterize those phases. So that led us to articulate this overarching hypothesis for what we were going to do here. We're going to call these mystery phases that are forming in these bottles that seem to be driving the abiotic degradation of TCE. We're going to call them reactive mineral intermediates, and the reason for that phrase is kind of embedded in this definition, which is the bullets below. So the idea is that under conditions of active precipitation in situ, you get the formation of authigenic mineral phases. Authigenic means formed in situ. And these phases are amorphous and they're high surface area. And for those reasons and a number of other reasons having to do with things like their redox potentials, they're highly reactive with contaminants. They're also going to be highly reactive with other things like, say, oxygen. And as a result, there's going to be a competition for these reactive mineral intermediate phases with everything that's available in the system to react with them. So that would include the contaminants and oxygen and anything else. And so that results in a condition where you have essentially a steady state concentration or a transient intermediate concentration of these RMI phases. And because they're dynamic and they're vulnerable in this way, they're hard to sample and to characterize. You can't pull a sample out of the ground and put it in a bag and send it off to a lab and expect the results you get back to be representative of what was going on in situ. So I want to make the point before I go any further with this is that although the emphasis that we're putting on this RMI idea is kind of novel, but with respect to the dynamic transient intermediate aspect of it, the general idea that secondary mineral phases are more reactive than primary mineral phases and they exist in the environment is hardly new. And there's lots of other work out there by different groups that support aspects of this, the story that we're going to give here. I'm just featuring one example from this is a paper from Lisa Axe's group. There's a series of that they published where they did a fairly detailed sampling of a field site versus depth. That's the figure on the left, where they measured concentration of iron and sulfur. That's the green and black markers in that figure. They correlated to some lithology, which is the middle part of the figure, and they even did some microbiology characterization, which is the right part of that figure. And in a subsequent paper, which I'm not showing you, they related that to measured concentrations of chlorinated solvent degradation. And they conclude that these what they call reactive iron mineral coatings are contributing to the abiotic reduction of the chlorinated solvent. So to put this into the sort of bigger perspective of ANA, we drew this scheme a few years ago where we have these four corners of this diagram, which represent the main components of the system. There's the microbiology in the upper left. Ultimately, its metabolism is driving the creation of reducing conditions. One of the things that happens is that produces primary mineralogy, which has got iron 2 or reduced sulfur in it. So that's things like pyrite and magnetite. That's in the upper right. Now we're putting the emphasis here on what we're calling the secondary mineralogy or reactive mineral intermediate phases. That's the lower right in this figure. And then several of those three things, the microbiology, the primary mineralogy, and the secondary mineralogy, could all contribute to the reduction of contaminants, which is in the lower left of this figure. So they're obviously interrelated in various ways that are represented by the arrows. The one important point I want to make here is that our hypothesis is basically that the secondary mineral phases are primarily what's responsible for contaminant reduction under ANA conditions. The primary mineral phases are going to be, we think, are less significant. And so that's, in theory, a testable hypothesis, which I'll get to momentarily. So the project objectives were to clarify the role of abiotic natural attenuation versus other attenuation processes, specifically to define the role of the hypothesized reactive mineral intermediate phases in ANA, and then explore how all that might be related to active-passive transitions, which is today's main theme, and ultimately to try to incorporate that into a biogeochemically enabled conceptual site model. In theory, taking the results of this project and feeding them back into the kind of tools that Dave described in the previous presentation, so that his model could basically incorporate the insights that are derived from this study. So our approach had several elements. One of them was to mine existing data, both with respect to the environmental mineral phases and also the contaminant reactivity. Also to measure new data, because it was clear that there's lots of data gaps. And we did that both with batch experiments, which are well mixed and closed systems, and in column experiments, which are flowing systems that are by comparison, open systems. And then to try to put that together into a geochemically enabled reactive transport model. So with respect to results on the first part, we did an extensive exercise in mining the literature for the thermodynamics of mineral phases that might be playing a role as mineral abiotic reductants in these systems. And we compiled all that data in an Excel spreadsheet and wrote a bunch of formulas that gave it the capability to calculate free energies of essentially any arbitrary combination of iron containing mineral phases and dissolved species. And then from there, you can calculate the redox potential, and you can use that as a way to try to assess what the driving force for reduction might be from any combination of hypothesized reaction that you might be considering to use to try to explain what evidence you might have for an ANA type component in chlorinated solvent degradation. So this tool is just focused on the mineralogy aspect. It's currently openly available via the open access website called Zenodo. The link is there. You can easily search up that website. You can find it by either typing my name into that website or searching the acronym IMTD, which stands for Iron Mineral Thermodynamic Database. Again, it's an Excel spreadsheet, so it should be totally accessible to you, and it's fun. It's also fun to play with because it allows you to visualize a lot of things that you have been thinking about for a while in that context. On the contaminant dechlorination side of things, so the contaminant property aspect, we did an extensive mining of the literature for reaction rate constants, and we compiled them in a database which is not yet openly available. That's on the to-do list for the near future. But we did publish a version of this in a review paper, which I'm happy to send to you. It occurred to me a few minutes ago that I didn't include that in the supporting information at the end of this slide deck. So you just have to email me if you want a direct copy of that. The one version of that database is shown here in this bubble plot. On the y-axis here are a variety of different chlorinated solvents. On the x-axis here are a variety of different mineral reductants. And the key novelty to this figure is that the size of the bubbles in that figure are proportional to the rate constant, specifically in this case, the log of the surface area normalized rate constant. And so bigger circles means bigger rate constants. And so if you see a case where there's a whole bunch of color, that means that there's a lot of data and that they vary over the ranges represented by the variability in the circle size. The other key thing to notice here is that the blue markers are for mineral phases without addition of extra iron 2. The red ones are data that are obtained in systems where the mineral phase specified on the x-axis was there. It was the basis of the system, but they added iron 2 to the system, and that enhanced the reactivity. Another thing to note is that in the cases where you see crosses or X's, those are places where we annotated combinations of the contaminant on the Y and on the mineral on the X, where experiments have been done and no reaction was recorded or observed. And we did that on purpose to get past the problem of people not reporting negative results, right? Because that's a problem in a figure like this. There's a lot of nodes in that figure where there are no markers at all, but you don't really know whether that means that there's no reaction or nobody's done the experiments or nobody's reported them. And so the X's and the pluses mean somebody did the experiments and concluded that there was no reaction. So there's lots of things one can do in interpreting this figure. I don't have time to go through very much of it. Just note, for example, that the second column from the left is McKinowite. That's a classical sort of secondary amorphous iron sulfide phase, and it dominates reactivity of all the species in the absence of added iron 2. Interestingly, the other one that actually has the most big circles is goethite with added iron 2. But there's very little data, for example, on the green rusts. That's the second to the last set of columns on the right side, and also on clays, which is the far right. And if you focus on the vertical on this, you can see that there's plenty of data for carbon tetrachloride, that's CT. But for other chlorinated methanes, there's next to nothing because they're much less reactive. Hexachloroethane, that's HCA, is pretty reactive, and there's plenty of data, but as soon as you start to go to the less halogenated compounds, the amount of data drops off. PCE and TCE, there's plenty of data, but also lots of data gaps because of its relatively lower reactivity. All right, so we're working on trying to fill some of those data gaps, and so we've done lots of experiments, and Michelle's in the process of publishing several new papers that contain results that look like the ones that are summarized in this figure here. So what they did here is they switched their focus to cis-DCE because that seemed like a priority data gap. And then basically the idea was, can they get any evidence for abiotic natural reduction of cis-DCE under any sort of batch bottle type of experiments? And the results are summarized in the figure on the right. They're sorted in order of decreasing amount of reaction. As you can see, the only one that showed a lot of reactivity was iron sulfide, in this case at pH 10. A few others just below that showed significant amount of reactivity, green rusts, magnetite with high loadings of iron 2. But as you drop down below that, it drops off to pretty much zero pretty quick. So, the bottom line conclusion is that you can only imagine abiotic natural attenuation of cis-DCE under very optimized, for the most part, unrealistic conditions that you might see in the environment. And note that on the photo that's in the figure, the bottle on the left is just the color of the pure iron oxide, and the bottle on the right is the color once you start to precipitate that FeOH2-like phase that I mentioned in the second and third slides of the presentation. So now we've been going on to try to extend this to column type experiments, and most of the data we've collected has been with these big columns. There's a whole set of them there that are shown in that photograph. They've been dosed with a cocktail of 3 different VOCs, carbon tet for one that's easy to dechlorinate, TCE for the one that's of greatest concern and kind of less moderately low reactivity, and trichloropropane, which interestingly acts as essentially as a conservative tracer under these conditions. The columns contain a variety of, or are packed with sand, with or without magnetite, and some of them are dosed with iron 2, most of them are dosed with lactate, some of them also get sulfate, et cetera. We measure lots of things, both on the effluent and in the ports along the column length, everything from pH, EH, iron 2, dissolved iron 2, and the VOC concentrations. And as you'll see in a minute, we've done something a little bit novel here, where we've operated the columns not just in continuous flow mode, but also in stop flow mode. So the idea of the stop flow mode thing was basically that it might help us get at this active passive transition thing. And so the hypothesis would be that under steady flow, you generate a stable gradient, which is similar to what you might get under natural conditions or steady pumping in a field site. Under stop flow conditions, you simulate something that might be akin to a variable natural gradient situation, or transition from passive or active to passive remediation. And so we tried to use this as both an experimental and also a thought experiment to try to think about what an APT, active passive transition, would do to all the in situ geochemistry that might be deriving ANA. And so we summarized a lot of our thinking in this figure on the right. And there's multiple, again, more there than I can fully describe. But the main thing to see for here is that the things that are known that are measured are in solid lines, and the things that are just hypothesized for now are in the dashed lines. And so the first one is the flow. In our stop flow experiments, we know the flow rate before and after. Down below there, under lactate, we measured lactate and we know what the influent was, and then we know what the effluent was. We measured ferrous iron, and it does this interesting thing where it drops slowly and then jumps up and then drops slowly again. I'll show you that in the next slide in data. We measured TCE and carbon tet. Those are at the bottom of this. Everything else, the dashed lines are all essentially speculation at this point. And so they're open to discussion. So for example, you can see we drew some somewhat complicated things going on for, say, sulfide. We don't really know whether that's what's happening under these conditions, but we think that that's probably the case. Probably the most interesting one is the 1/3 from the bottom, which is the RMI, the reactive mineral intermediate phase. Remember, I said that that's kind of a steady state transient thing that's impractical to measure. So we don't really have any direct way of knowing what that number would be, or what that population of RMI phase might be. But we hypothesized that under steady flow conditions, it would be steady. And then under stop flow conditions, it would change, and it might change suddenly. That's the little drop there, and then more gradually later on. So to see what kind of evidence, experimental evidence we have for all that, here is some data from the column that contained no magnetite. So it's packed sand, no magnetite, but it was fed iron 2 during the course of the experiment. And this is iron 2 measured, dissolved iron 2 measured in the pore waters taken from the ports along the column. That's the colored markers and lines, where the darker color is the beginning of the column, and the lighter, hotter color is towards the end of the column. And then the x-axis here is actual calendar clock time. for operation of the column. And so you can see in the left side of the figure that iron 2 steadily decreases over operating time at all ports. So we assume, well, I'll leave the interpretation to the next slide. During the stop flow event, you can see, sorry, I didn't say that the stop flow events are the gray shaded zones in the middle of the figure at 200 days and towards the right of the figure just past 400 days. So during the stop flow event, you see a rebound in iron 2. That we didn't see coming, and that's certainly an interesting result. And the question is, what does it mean? The other thing to note, which we don't really have an explanation for, is that the size of the rebound got smaller with the second iteration, and that's something that we probably should repeat before we spend too much time trying to interpret it. But the interpretation that we give the main characteristics of this figure are as follows. Under steady flow conditions, that favors formation and a stable population of the RMI phase. And that results in less iron 2 measurable in solution because it's tied up in the RMI phase. And that RMI phase favors abiotic degradation of the chlorinated solvents. And as you'll see in the next slide, that produces degradation of the chlorinated solvents. Under the stop flow conditions, that it destabilizes the RMI phase, and you end up essentially releasing iron 2 into the solution, and perhaps that would result in be less favorable for ANA. And possibly this kind of treatment could be sort of extended or inverted to use as a diagnostic for the role of reactive mineral intermediates. So the data that we have on actual dechlorination are limited, but this is a representative set of them. They're a little complicated to interpret, so I'll try to not get lost in the details. But on the left, we have a steady flow data from taken during steady flow, where the x-axis is concentration taken along ports along the length of the column. And so that's essentially contact time. On the right figure, it's under stop flow conditions. So now we don't really expect the ports along the column to show us anything different. So we're just going to use port 1 for this. We have data for the other ports. But what now goes on the x-axis is clock time. And so what you see in concentration of both carbon tet, TCE carbon tet on the y-axis of both, TCE is the blue squares, and then some products, chloroform, carbon disulfide, and CO are a subset of the products that we measured. And the key thing you see on the left is that both TCE and carbon tet go away under these conditions. Neither of those are simple first-order kinetics. They're fit with a dual bimodal kinetic model, so that we've got two half-lives at the beginning, 5 hours and 14 hours, and at the end, 21 hours and 23 hours. Over on the other side, in stop flow condition, they both look like they're producing essentially just first-order kinetics, and so we'll fit them to just one rate constant, and that translates to about half-life of about 20 weeks on TCE. And 15 hours or so on for carbon tet. The comparison between the two of them is really revealing. So under the steady flow conditions, degradation of TC initially is very rapid, and then it tails off, which may be related to consumption of the RMI phase. Carbon tet, which is much more easily reduced, produces a much more uniform profile, which is probably a reflection of the fact that it's easier to reduce. So it doesn't require as strongly reducing an RMI phase as the TCE does. And under the stop flow conditions, the carbon tet actually ends up being more reactive by a lot, and that's presumably because the RMI that's necessary for ANA of TCE is being depleted, and so that process slows way down, whereas the carbon tet process is not as much affected because it doesn't require as effective or strongly reducing phase. So that's a lot of details that we still need to write up and summarize so that they can be digested more fully by you all and everyone else. So with that, I'll just summarize. The first part of this was about the in situ mineralogy aspect, particularly the idea that the RMI phase is dynamic and transient, and so intrinsically not something you can characterize using traditional methods. But it appears that you need that kind of reactive phase, RMI or whatever else you want to call it, to get significant abiotic natural attenuation of chlorinated ethenes. And then the implications for APTs are still a little bit to be determined, but it's pretty clear from these results that a active to passive transition is going to have a pretty significant effect on whatever ANA processes might be occurring in your system. I'll note that the benefits to DOE are several-fold here. Partly they are focused on the management of groundwater sites with chlorinated solvent contamination. In particular, we would hope that these results would help you be able to explain apparent ANA. So when you have evidence that should suggest that, this gives you tools or ideas and information to try to interpret that and to justify remedies based on ANA if it all holds together. And further, ultimately, even optimize the application of ANA on any particular scenario. It should also help a bit in explaining the effects of APTs, and so that's all focused on chlorinated ethenes. That's the scope of this project. However, we would point out that all of what I said here could apply to other types of contaminants. So that would include nitro reduction of explosives, TNT, RDX, et cetera. There may even be relevance of this to the oxidative processes that people have recently become quite interested in, sort of Fenton-like oxidation processes that occur in their in situ conditions catalyzed by iron minerals. It's quite likely that that iron mineral catalysis is favored by the RMI phase. We haven't really proven that yet, but it's quite likely there's relevance to that, and that in turn has some relevance to the fate of PFAS. So this could have several lives to come after the end of this particular project. The two published papers that I mentioned at the very beginning are Culpepper et al. And Entwistle et al. Is the second one. The first one's in ESPI, the second one's in ES&T. The references are here. I can send you those if you can't get them some other way. Just feel free to email me with that. There's also some links here for other ways to get information from this project, in addition to my email. The thermodynamic database that I mentioned at the beginning is linked on the Zenodo website. There is also other versions of webinars that we've given in this general area at my YouTube channel. And you can easily find that stuff there. With that, I'll stop and take questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. We have received a number of questions. The first one is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. At many sites with finer grained soils with iron content, we see TCE and DCE disappear, either by active treatment or natural attenuation, but little or no vinyl chloride is measured. Have you evaluated the abiotic degradation of vinyl chloride, and do you have any opinions on the driving mechanism for its disappearance at these sites?
Interesting question. So I guess I would need to clarify whether you think the vinyl chloride is not being produced or whether it was there and then degraded. So if the question is really about the former, then the answer would be essentially the same as the argument that lots of people have made about the advantage of abiotic dechlorination processes over biotic dechlorination processes. So there's lots and lots of evidence that the abiotic processes, whether they be by zero valent iron or any of the other minerals, they all seem to do the similar thing, which is that they favor dechlorination by the so-called reductive elimination pathway which goes via the acetylene intermediates, which makes an end run around vinyl chloride. So you don't make vinyl chloride. And so that way you don't accumulate vinyl chloride and you don't have that stall intermediate problem. That also, the same thing applies to the cis intermediates. That's now one thing on the, and that's likely to be the, maybe the answer to the question. But if the question was really, we have vinyl chloride and we know it's going away, that's very different. So we have not tried to study abiotic degradation of vinyl chloride in this study yet, partly because we assume that that would be even more difficult, slower, harder to get any significant abiotic or reduction than cis DCE even. And so we don't really have any data that I can think of that would support the idea that there's an abiotic component to the degradation of vinyl chloride under these types of conditions. I would only add one caveat would be that if the conditions were such that you could get that Benton-like catalyzed oxidative transformation that I mentioned just in the very next to last slide, then yeah, that would degrade vinyl chloride. But that may be the necessary explanation, but that's pretty speculative.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. That's a really great and comprehensive response. This next question is from the University of Delaware. Can you comment on how the amount and reactivity of RMIs is influenced by the underlying mineral phase?
That would have a long and complicated and underlying or speculative response. There's a lot of different ways I could go with that. So maybe one thing I would say and not go further with it for now would be that remember that early on in the talk, I a couple of times used the term structural iron 2. So I think the question really is somebody that's thinking about the role of structural iron 2, which is iron 2, which is in the underlying mineral phase, which in theory could contribute to reduction of contaminants, as opposed to the iron 2, which is on the surface of the materials. And that is mainly the RMI phase that I'm describing in this presentation. Those two things are clearly going to be linked. There's the possibility of passing electrons between the underlying mineral phase and the overlying RMI phase. That's very analogous to what we've studied for years on the ZVI system, where you've got an iron 0 core and an iron oxide coating. So that's entirely possible, but at this point, we don't have any evidence to suggest that there's any specific scenario where the underlying mineral phase does anything other than provide a support for the RMI phase.
Great, thank you, Paul. This next question says the following: the work in this project that you discussed focuses primarily on chlorinated solvents. Do you believe that your work can be applied to other contaminant classes like metals, explosives, or PFAS? Is anyone working on that?
Well, I kind of addressed that in one of the very last bullets already. There's no doubt that this applies easily to nitro reduction of explosives, because they're easier to reduce than the chlorinated solvents. So everything that I said today should apply on steroids. It should be faster and easier and more extensive. Metals I didn't say anything about up till now. So metals would introduce a few complications. Certainly, there are a lot of metals where reduction can, for example, in the case of chromate, can result in reductive sequestration and immobilization. And some of this might be relevant to that. Certainly the possibility of the reduction of the metal is there, but that quickly gets complicated because the metals don't go away as dissolved products. They deposit onto the surfaces, and now you've altered your RMI surface, right? And so that it's a more complicated problem. There are other classes of contaminants that one could extend this to that I haven't said nothing about up till now. Just to give one example, nitrate. So nitrate is a groundwater contaminant, right? And so it's subject to reduction. And what happens under situations like this? We don't normally think of there being as any abiotic nitrate reduction, but those types of non-organic contaminants might have interesting effects in these systems.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Let's try and pull Dave back into this discussion, and I'm going to ask you both, and we'll start by Dave. For the kinds of tools and approaches that you both discussed, what type of regulatory acceptance or buy-in do you expect? Dave?
It's a good question. So part of what we're trying to do is make sure that the stuff that we presented in this tool is aligned with other people that might be working on this. And so, for example, ITRC, just came out with their pump and treat optimization guidance, and they have some stuff on transitioning in there. And so a lot of our stuff, I feel like lines up very well with the recommendations, the stepwise procedures that they have in there. And so that has a lot of regulator buy-in. And then, our overall project goal is just to make everything transparent. So it's saying, I'm going to do these analyses, or I'm going to do this within a tool. It's very easy for, different people that are part of a project team, including, regulatory authorities, to also work with the same set of data. So I think that the way that we're trying to at least create this lends itself really well to having regulatory buy-in.
So in my case, the implementation of that question would be more specific. Supposing that you were trying to convince a regulator to approve a site management plan where you wanted to invoke ANA as a polishing step for your remedy, and you even have a active to passive transition in your plan, and you're going to try to rationalize what you think is going to happen based on the kind of concepts that I described. On the one hand, I think you would be under solid ground in that it's intuitive that most of what I said has to be true, based on a lot of things everything we know about the basic processes involved. On the other hand, if the regulator came back and said, show me the data that proves that that's true on this particular site, that would be tough. So,
Great. Well, thank you both. This has been really engaging. And we very much appreciate the time that you've dedicated to preparing and delivering this webinar. At this point, we're going to go ahead and wrap up and remind everyone that these webinars take place every couple of weeks. The next webinar is on Thursday, October 5, and it's an EW webinar that will focus on DoD-funded research efforts to support the transition to electric vehicles, specifically on military installations. This webinar will feature two speakers, Mr. Cabell Hodge from National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Mr. Frank Holcomb from the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. Just a reminder that registration is open for webinars through the end of this year, and the 2024 lineup should be announced soon. So please make sure to visit our webinar webpage to register for upcoming webinars. Before we conclude, I'd like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage in case you'd like to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it at this time if you can please take a moment to complete the very brief survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you so much for joining us.